In this video, we're going to factor quadratics, and they're going to be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where you have some number other than 1 multiplied by the x squared term. So this one's a little more complex compared to the one where you just have 1 multiplied by x squared, or it's written as x squared. So in this, you're always going to start out factoring the same way. You're going to start breaking the problem down just a little bit before you can start factoring it. So you have to find two integers where these two integers m and p add together to equal the value of b, which is the number, the coefficient of x, the number multiplied by x. And those same numbers m and p, they multiply together to equal a times c. So the number multiplied by x squared multiplied by the number that's by itself. Once you find what those values are, you use them to break the bx term down. So that middle term, it's broken down into two. So these are the first steps that you use on all of these, and then you can start factoring from there. So let's start factoring some problems. So our first one, we have 4x squared plus 23x plus 15. So in this, I need to figure out which two numbers I can add together to equal 23, and I multiply together to equal 4 times 15, which is 60. Okay, the easiest thing to do is look at the factors of 60. We have 60 times 1, which will never give me 23. 60 and plus 1 is not 23. We have 30 times 2. 30 plus 2 is not 23. I'm going to keep going. We have 20 times 3. 20 plus 3 does give me 23. So 20 plus 3 equals 23, and 20 times 3 is equal to 60. So we're going to use that to split this middle term into two terms. Okay, so we have 23x is split up into 20x plus 3x. And I have to bring down the 4x squared plus 20x plus 3x, bring down the plus 15. So you're just splitting that middle term apart into two. The rest of the problem comes down and is exactly the same. The reason that we're splitting it into two is so that we can look at the first two terms. I'm going to put them in parentheses, and then the last two terms go in parentheses. You always want addition between the two sets of parentheses. I didn't change the problem at all because technically these parentheses don't mean much because we still have addition between them. But what we're going to use them for is to factor out their greatest common factor, so what they have in common with each other. I can divide both 4 and 20 by 4, and this one has an x squared, we have an x, so because they both have at least one x, we can factor an x out. And then we're going to write in parentheses what's left over. 4x squared divided by 4x leaves us with x. Bring down the plus. 20x divided by 4x is 5. Plus, all right, in this one, I can factor out a 3 because both 3 and 15 are divisible by 3. And I'm left with 3x divided by 3 is x, plus 15 divided by 3 is 5. Okay, so if you notice, when I factored out the greatest common factor, what I'm left with, well, I have two terms here multiplied by the same thing. I wanted to have what's left in the parentheses on both of these be exactly the same, because if they're the same, I can factor out that greatest common factor. So now my new greatest common factor is x plus 5, because both of these have an x plus 5. So when you factor out the greatest common factor, you multiply it by what's left over. Okay, so times, well, x plus 5 was originally multiplied by 4x, so I'm reading that down. And x plus 3 was originally multiplied by 3. So I have to bring down this plus 3. Okay, so x plus 5 times 4x plus 3. And if I re-multiply, I can use FOIL, I will get this answer up here. So this is 4x squared plus 23x plus 15 factored. All right, so we're going to move on to the next one. 3x squared minus 1x minus 2. So I'm just going to put a 1 there so I remember that negative x is the same thing as negative 1x. I have to figure out what I can add together to equal that negative 1 and multiply together to equal 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. All right, because I'm multiplying two numbers together and getting a negative, I know one's positive and one's negative. All right, and when I add those numbers together, if one's positive and one's negative and I get a negative value, I know the negative term or the negative integer has to be my larger one. So positive one's smaller. So I look at the factors of 6. Well, I know one's positive, one's negative. So negative 6 times 1, well, that gives me 5. Negative 1 times 6 gives me positive 5. This one was negative 5, this one's positive 5. So I know those don't work. I can do 2 times negative 3. That does give me negative 1. If I had said negative 2 times 3, it would give me positive 1. So just be careful you're paying attention to which ones add together to, in this case, give you the negative 1. So these ones work. So I have a positive 2 and a negative 3. And really, when you're breaking it down, it doesn't matter which one you put first. So here we bring down our 3x squared. Remember this negative 1x is split into 2, and it's split into a positive 2x minus 3x. Bring down the negative 2, or minus 2. So that middle term's just split into 2. That's what this work was, and you bring down the first and last term. Okay. Here's where it's slightly different than the last one. You're still going to put parentheses around your first two terms, but remember I said you wanted plus to be in between, in the middle. Well, we know that minus 3x is the same thing as plus negative 3x. So my negative 3x goes in the parenthesis, and plus is still between the two parentheses. So make sure you have plus out between the parentheses. All right, so in this first term, I can factor out an x. And I'm left with 3x plus 2, because 3x squared divided by x is 3x. 2x divided by x is 2. I have plus in the middle. All right, over here. Remember how I said in this step right here, we wanted what's in the parentheses to be the same, meaning I want 3x plus 2 to be in this other parenthesis over here. Well, it's a negative 3x minus 2. I need them both to be positive, so the only thing I can factor out is a negative 1 to make them both positive in there. Because if I do negative 3x divided by negative 1, it leaves me with that positive 3x. So I'm going to factor out a negative 1 times, again, negative 3x divided by negative 1x is positive 3x. And the other thing is you always have to factor something out. So if it was positive 1, negative 1, something has to be factored out for this. All right, negative 2 divided by negative 1 is positive 2. Okay, so when I factored out negative 1, these are left the same. So this is my greatest common factor. Again, now I factor out the greatest common factor, which is 3x plus 2. And I multiply it by whatever is left over. I have an x plus negative 1 or x minus 1. And that is my answer. If you had put the negative 3x in front, the positive 2x in front, you would end up with these same two factors. So you would have 3x plus 2 times x minus 1. And it doesn't matter which set of parentheses come first. It could be written as x minus 1 times 3x plus 2. As long as what's inside is the same, you're good. All right, this one, 2x squared minus 4x plus 2, we have to figure out what we add together to equal negative 4, what we multiply together to equal 2 times 2 is positive 4. All right, so I'm going to start thinking about the factors. Well, multiply together to equal positive, but add together to equal negative. Well, they both have to be negative in that case. Well, one that comes to mind right away is negative 2 and negative 2. Because negative 2 plus negative 2 is negative 4. Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. So I use that to split up my middle term. Negative 4x is negative 2x minus 2x. I have to bring down that 2x squared in front, bring down the plus 2 in the back. Okay, put parentheses around the first two terms. Remember, you don't want subtraction in the middle. You want it to be addition, so you're going to change minus 2x to plus negative 2x. Now we have plus in between and negative 2x plus 2 in the second parenthesis. All right, we're going to see what we can factor out. In this first parenthesis, I can factor out 2x. 2x squared divided by 2x leaves me with x, minus 2x divided by 2x is 1. Plus, all right, so here's the tricky part. I want it to be x minus 1 in the parenthesis, in both parentheses. Okay, I know that this first, right here, I have a negative 2x. I don't want that to be negative because my x here has to be positive. So what I can factor out is a negative 2, and that will leave my x value positive. Negative 2x divided by negative 2 is positive 1x or positive x. Positive 2 divided by negative 2 is negative 1. So now it's the same thing in both parentheses, which is my greatest common factor. So factor out what they have in common. They both have an x minus 1. Multiply it by what's left over. We have a 2x plus negative 2 or minus 2. All right, then over here, we're going to figure out what we can add together to equal negative 1, multiply together to equal 3 times 5 is 15. Okay, well, if they multiply to equal positive, add to equal a negative, we know they're both negative. So let's look at the factors of 15. So we know they're both negative. Negative 15 times negative 1. Well, add them together. Negative 15 plus negative 1 is not negative 1. We have negative 5 times negative 3. Negative 5 plus negative 3 is negative 8. That's not negative 1. And 15 doesn't have any other factors. So because you cannot multiply them together, multiply any of the factors together and add them at the same time to get the numbers that we need, this one's called prime. It's prime because it cannot be factored. Okay? You need to be careful because sometimes you might just be missing a factor. Don't just assume right away, I can't factor it. Go through all the factors, double check that it cannot be factored into two terms that when you add them together, they equal that middle term. So be very careful with that, but this one is prime. I'm going to give you 4 problems to go ahead and go through. My hint is one of them is prime, so go ahead and try them out, and when you're ready, come back and I'll go through the answers with you. All right, the first one, what we add together to equal 11, multiply together to equal 5 times 2 is 10. So in this one, it is 10 and 1. 10 plus 1 is 11. 10 times 1 is 10. So that means this middle term gets broken down into 10x plus 1x. I have to bring down the 5x squared. This is plus because it's a positive 10x. Bring down the plus 2. Right? Put parentheses around the first two terms, last two with plus in between. First one, I can factor out a 5x, and I'm left with x plus 2. Plus, second one, I can't factor out anything, but remember I said before, you have to factor something out. So if you can't factor out anything, well, you can always factor 1 out. Because if I redistribute 1, I'm left with x plus 2 inside. 1 times x is still 1x, or just x, plus 1 times 2 is 2. So factoring out 1 doesn't change it. Okay, factor out your greatest common factor, which is x plus 2. And we're left with 5x plus 1. All right, number 2. We need to see what adds together to equal 8, multiplies together to equal -2 times -6 is positive 12. Okay, in this case, they're both going to be positive. And you might be confused because you say, well, in our problem up here we have negatives, but it's okay, that the negatives will be taken care of. This is just to break down that middle term. All right, we have, in this case, 6 and 2. 6 times 2 is 12, and 6 plus 2 is 8. Breaks down that middle term. So we have a positive 6x plus 2x. Bring down that negative 2x squared in front and the minus 6 in back. Put your first two terms in parentheses and your last two. All right, on this one, I don't like having my x negative. I want to factor, because it's negative 2x squared, I don't want it to be negative, so I'm actually going to factor that negative out. I have negative, I can divide both by 2, so that can be factored out. Both have at least one x, so I can factor out an x. Negative 2x squared divided by negative 2x is just x. Positive 6x divided by negative 2x is negative 3. Plus, well, it also helps me out factoring out that negative over here, because now I can get them to be the same, both x minus 3. Over here I just have to factor out a positive 2, and I'm left with x minus 3. So my new greatest common factor is x minus 3, it's in both, and it's multiplied by what's left over, negative 2x plus 2. All right, last two. To figure out what we can add together to equal 3, multiply together to equal 5 times 4 is 20. All right, so in this case, we look at the factors of 20. 20 times 1, well, that won't give me 3. We have 10 times 2, that won't give me 3. We have 5 times 4, that won't give me 3 when I add them together. So this one is also prime. And your last one, figure out what you add together to equal negative 18. Multiply together to equal 3 times 15 is 45. And we know that they both have to be negative because that's the only way to get a positive when multiplied and a negative when added. So you can go through all the factors. Hopefully you got negative 15 and negative 3. And it doesn't matter which one you put first because you'll still get the same factors once we factor it. Factor negative 18x down into negative 15x minus 3x. Bring down that 3x squared in front, the plus 15 in back. Put the first in parentheses. I'm going to change minus to plus negative 3x. So in this first one, I'm going to factor out 3x, and I'm left with x minus 5 plus, I don't want this to be negative, so I'm going to factor out -3. Negative 3x divided by -3 is x. 15 divided by -3 is -5. So I got them to be the same. Greatest common factor is x minus 5. It's in both. And that's multiplied by what's left over. 3x plus -3 is -3. Hopefully you're able to get those and you were able to factor quadratics.